Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 12, verse 2, which reads, "A good man obtains favor from the Lord, but a man of evil devices he condemns." Ooh, man. I wanted to unpack this verse because we live in a world that is obsessed with performance metrics, right? Your GPA, your salary, your follower count, your reputation amongst the people whose opinions seem to matter most, right? And so from the time we are old enough to be evaluated, we're basically being measured by visible external standards. And naturally, we start to assume that the God of the universe operates on a similar system, that he is somewhere up there running the numbers, checking the boxes, and dispensing favor based on who looks the best on paper. But this verse right here, Proverbs 12:2, steps into that assumption and quietly dismantles it. Not by saying God does not care about how we live, because he absolutely does, but by reframing what he is actually paying attention to. The verse draws a straight line between the condition of a person's character and God's response to them. And the contrast it draws is not between the successful and the unsuccessful, or the smart and the foolish, or even the religious and the irreligious. It is between the good and the scheming. And that distinction is worth noting and studying here carefully, because it is more specific and more penetrating than it first appears. So let's break down the verse. A good man obtains favor from the Lord. The word good here is doing more work than we typically give it credit for. In the biblical framework, goodness is not just a personality trait or a general vibe. It describes someone whose character is genuinely aligned with God's own character. Someone who's honest, just, generous, and oriented toward what is right, not because it benefits them, but because it reflects who they actually are on the inside. So this is an important clarification right out of the gate, because the word good gets watered down constantly in everyday usage, right? We call someone good because they are polite, or because they have not committed any major crimes, or because they tip well at restaurants. But the goodness Solomon is describing goes much deeper than social niceness, right? It is the kind of goodness that holds up when no one is watching, that does not require an audience to function. The word favor, which in the Hebrew language is translated to ratzon, is worth pausing on briefly, because it is genuinely important here. Ratzon describes the pleasure, delight, and approval of God, the sense that you are someone God looks at with genuine warmth and active goodwill. So this is not God tolerating you from a distance. It's actually God being pleased with you and responding accordingly. Throughout the Psalms, obtaining the favor of God is described as the foundation of everything else going well. And so in Psalms 5:12, David captures it directly. He says, "For if you bless the righteous, O Lord, you cover him with favor as with a shield." And so the favor of God is not just an emotional endorsement. It is proactive, protective, generative, and life-shaping. What is remarkable about this first line is the directness of the transaction. The good man does not strive for God's favor, perform for it, or negotiate for it. He obtains it the way you obtain something that is naturally yours to have because of who you are. Goodness and divine favor are presented as going together the way roots and stability go together. Now let's talk about the part where it says, "But a man of evil devices he condemns." Because here is where the verse gets specific in a way that is easy to miss if we read it too quickly. Solomon does not contrast the good man with the bad man in some vague general sense, but he contrasts him with a man of evil devices. The word devices refers to schemes, plans, and deliberate strategies for getting what you want through dishonest means. So this is a particular kind of person, not someone who stumbles into sin through weakness or temptation in the moment, but someone who sits down and plans it. Someone who is strategic about their manipulation, their deception, their exploitation of others. The evil devices are premeditated. They're the product of a heart that has decided that the ends justify whatever means are necessary to get there. This is where a common misunderstanding of the verse needs to be addressed directly, though. You know, it would be easy to read Proverbs 12:2 as a simple good people win, bad people lose formula, a kind of karma theology where God is just running a cosmic scoreboard. But, you know, that's not what Solomon is describing here. You know, the condemnation of the man of evil devices is not an arbitrary punishment handed down from on high. It is a natural consequence of a life that has been built on a foundation of deceit. And so, you know, scheming is self-defeating by nature. When your path forward depends on manipulation and dishonesty, you're constantly building on sand. Every relationship is compromised because it is based on a false version of you. Every gain is insecure because it was obtained through means that cannot be sustained. And ultimately, you're positioning yourself in opposition to a God who, as Proverbs 12:17 says, breathes out truth. So the condemnation God brings out against the schemer is in many ways simply God allowing the natural trajectory of that life to arrive at its destination. You know, in Romans 1:28, Paul describes a similar dynamic when he writes that God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And so God's judgment is sometimes not a lightning bolt from the sky, but the removal of his restraining hand from a path that was already headed somewhere destructive. And then Jeremiah 17:9-10 ties these two halves of the verse together with striking clarity. He says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick, so who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds." And so God's responses to people are based on what he finds when he searches the heart, not what he observes on the surface. And so the good man and the schemer may look identical from the outside in certain seasons, but God is not even looking at the surface. So now I want to get practical and applicable, because I think that's where, you know, knowledge turns into action, which is the most important thing for us as Christians, right? And so the first thing is to let God's evaluation be the only one that actually shapes our behavior. Because most of us spend more energy, I feel like, managing our reputation among people who can see us from cultivating the character that God actually evaluates. We're careful about how we come across in a meeting, on social media, or in front of people whose opinion we care about. But Proverbs 12:2 is saying that the evaluation that produces the most consequential outcome, God's favor or condemnation, is based on something none of those people can see. And so the practical implication is that our private character deserves at least as much attention as our public presentation. You know, if we are only as honest, generous, and good as the situation requires for appearances, we are not the good person of verse 2. We're more of a socially sophisticated person of the schemer. Or at least we're reflecting it more accurately. And the second thing is to examine our strategies, not just our intentions. You know, the man of evil devices is not condemned simply for wanting things. Desire is not the problem. The problem is the strategies he deploys to get them. So this is a genuinely useful diagnostic for our own lives, because most of us do not think of ourselves as schemers. But if we're honest, we can probably identify places where we are pursuing legitimate goals through means that are less than honest, like inflating our contributions, shading the truth to make ourselves look better, manipulating a situation to come out on top at someone else's expense, right? These are devices. They may be smaller in scale than what Solomon had in mind, but they operate on the same logic. And so examining not just what we want, but how we are going about getting it is one of the most practically important forms of self-awareness wisdom asks of us. And then the last thing is to trust that genuine goodness is not invisible to God, even when it is invisible to everyone else. You know, one of the quieter discouragements of trying to live with genuine integrity is that it is often unnoticed, unrewarded, and sometimes actively goes disadvantaged in the short term. And the schemer sometimes gets the promotion, right? The manipulator sometimes wins the argument. Right, the dishonest person sometimes appears to have figured out something, or seems to have figured out that the honest person is missing. But Proverbs 12:2 is a long, game answer to that discouragement. The favor of God is being obtained in those unnoticed moments of genuine goodness, and it is worth infinitely more than whatever the schemer is gaining through his devices. So we do not need the room to notice, we just need God to notice, and according to this verse, he does. I just want to give a closing thought now, because Proverbs 12:2 is a verse about what God is actually paying attention to, and the answer it gives cuts through a lot of noise, right? Not your performance, not your reputation, not how effectively you have managed other people's perception of you, but your character. The real version, the one that shows up when the stakes are low and no one is watching. So the good man obtains favor, right? The schemer gets condemned, right? And the difference between them is not talent, opportunity, or even the scale of their own sin. It is the condition of the heart that is driving everything else. That is what God searches. That is what God sees. And that is what God responds to.